The secret agent's son changed an entire school. What happens when a 14-year-old boy becomes invisible in plain sight? When every morning feels like walking into a battlefield where the weapons are words and the wounds cut deeper than any blade ever could? Picture this: a small figure hunched over a worn wooden desk, fingers tracing the edges of a notebook filled with sketches that no one will ever see. The fluorescent lights of Hillcrest Middle School buzz overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across faces that have learned to look right through him. This is Liam Matthews, a boy whose tragedy began long before he ever stepped foot in these halls, but whose story is just beginning to unfold. The morning sun filters through grimy windows as Liam pushes through the heavy glass doors, his backpack patched with duct tape in 3 places, slung over one shoulder. His sneakers, once white but now a tired grey, make barely a whisper against the polished linoleum. He moves like a ghost through corridors filled with laughter that never includes him, conversations that pause when he passes, eyes that slide away the moment they might meet his. In homeroom, Mrs. Peterson calls attendance with the mechanical rhythm of someone who's done this for 27 years. "Liam Matthews," she calls, not even looking up from her clipboard. A quiet "here" floats from the back corner, where Liam sits sketching detailed mechanical blueprints in the margins of his English notebook. The boy beside him, a kid named Trevor with expensive sneakers and a father who drives a BMW, glances over and snorts. "What's that supposed to be, a spaceship?" He whispers loud enough for others to hear. Laughter ripples through nearby desks like poison in water. But Liam doesn't respond. He never responds. Instead, he closes the notebook with the careful precision of someone who's learned that showing pain only invites more of it. His grandfather's voice echoes in his memory. "Some battles aren't worth fighting, son. Save your strength for the ones that matter." The tragedy that shaped Liam into this quiet shadow happened 3 years ago on a rain-slicked highway outside of town. His parents, Sarah, a nurse who sang lullabies in 3 languages, and David, a mechanic who could fix anything with an engine, never made it home from their anniversary dinner. The drunk driver who crossed the center line walked away without a scratch. Liam, waiting up past midnight in his pajamas with a homemade card that read, "Happy Anniversary, Mum and Dad," learned that sometimes the world breaks things that can never be fixed. His grandfather, Harold Matthews, took him in without hesitation. But what could a 72-year-old man with arthritis and a social security check teach a traumatized 11-year-old about navigating a world that suddenly felt hostile and unpredictable? Harold did his best, but best wasn't enough to buy name-brand clothes or the latest shoes that marked social status in the brutal hierarchy of middle school. The trailer park where they lived sat on the outskirts of town like an afterthought, a collection of aging aluminum homes where dreams came to rust quietly. Liam's address alone was enough to mark him as different. While his classmates talked about vacation homes and ski trips, Liam learned to navigate conversations about weekend plans with careful vagueness. "Oh, just staying home," he'd say, never mentioning that home was a single wide trailer where the heat sometimes didn't work and the walls were thin enough to hear Mrs. Rodriguez next door crying during her late-night telenovelas. In the cafeteria, Liam sits alone at a table near the emergency exit, a strategic choice that allows for quick escapes when things get bad. His lunch consists of a peanut butter sandwich made with the generic brand Everything, an apple that's slightly bruised, and a thermos of water, because even milk costs extra when you're counting every penny. Around him, the social ecosystem of Hillcrest Middle School plays out with the precision of nature documentary footage. The popular kids claim the center tables like lions marking territory. Jake Morrison sits at the heart of it all, tall for his age, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that could charm teachers and intimidate classmates in equal measure. His father owns half the commercial real estate in town, and Jake wears that privilege like armor. To his left sits Marcus Chen, whose mother is a local news anchor, and to his right, Tyler Brooks, son of the high school football coach. They are untouchable, and they know it. Then there are the middle tables, kids who aren't popular but aren't outcasts, floating in the safe middle ground of teenage social survival. They watch the dynamics around them carefully, knowing that allegiances can shift overnight, and today's friend might be tomorrow's target. And then there's Liam's table. Population 1. The island of the forgotten, the overlooked, the deliberately ignored. But what none of them know, what Liam has never told anyone, not even his grandfather, is that behind those quiet eyes lies a mind that processes the world in ways they couldn't imagine. While they're gossiping about who's dating whom, Liam is mentally redesigning the school's outdated computer network. While they're complaining about math homework, he's solving problems 3 grade levels ahead just for the intellectual challenge. The bell rings, signaling the end of lunch, and Liam carefully packs his thermos back into his patched backpack. As he stands to leave, Jake's voice cuts through the cafeteria noise like a blade. "Hey, trailer park!" he calls out, just loud enough for their section to hear. "Lose something?" He's holding up a pencil, one of Liam's mechanical pencils that must have fallen from his bag. Liam turns, his heart beginning that familiar rapid-fire rhythm that means trouble is coming. "It's mine," he says quietly, stepping forward with his hand extended. Jake examines the pencil with exaggerated interest. This is yours." He shows it to his friends, who snicker appreciatively. "Must be nice having fancy school supplies when some of us have to work for what we have." The irony would be laughable if it weren't so cruel. Jake, whose weekly allowance could feed Liam for a month, lecturing about working for things. But Liam says nothing. He's learned that words are weapons that can be turned against you, and silence is sometimes the only shield you have. "Please," Liam says, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need it for class." Jake looks at him for a long moment, then tosses the pencil. Not to Liam, but to Marcus, who catches it with a grin. "Catch," Marcus says, throwing it to Tyler, who immediately tosses it back to Jake. "Keep away." The most juvenile of games, made vicious by an audience and the humiliation of a victim who can't fight back. Other students begin to notice. Some look away, uncomfortable, but unwilling to intervene. Others watch with the morbid fascination of witnesses to a car accident. A few even smile, grateful that someone else is the target today. The pencil flies back and forth above Liam's head as he stands in the middle, his face burning with shame, but his expression carefully neutral. This is survival. Show nothing. Give them nothing to feed on. Wait for it to end. His grandfather's voice whispers again. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is nothing at all. Finally, Jake grows bored with the game. He drops the pencil on the floor and steps on it, grinding it under his expensive sneaker until the plastic cracks. "Oops," he says with mock concern. "Sorry about that, trailer park. Accidents happen." Liam kneels to pick up the pieces of his broken pencil, his hands steady despite the rage building in his chest, like steam in a pressure cooker. Around him, students are dispersing, heading to their next classes, already forgetting what they've witnessed. By tomorrow, this will be just another story in the ongoing narrative of Liam Matthews getting what he deserves. But as Liam straightens up, clutching the fragments of his pencil, something crystallizes in his mind. Not revenge. That's too simple, too immediate. Something deeper. A quiet understanding that this moment, like all the others, is being stored away in a part of his brain that never forgets, never forgives, and never stops calculating. The afternoon classes blur together in a haze of teachers who don't quite see him, assignments that he completes with mechanical precision, and the constant low-level anxiety that comes with being prey in an ecosystem designed for predators. In algebra, Mrs. Henderson assigns problems that Liam solved in his head before she finished writing them on the board, but he shows his work carefully, deliberately making small mistakes to avoid unwanted attention. In English, they're reading To Kill a Mockingbird. And when Mrs. Garcia asks about the theme of social injustice, Liam raises his hand for the first time in weeks. His analysis is thoughtful, nuanced, drawing connections between Harper Lee's fictional Maycomb and their own small-town hierarchies. For a moment, the classroom is quiet, his words hanging in the air like music. Then Jake snorts. "Deep thoughts from the deep end," he mutters, just loud enough for his friends to hear, but too quiet for Mrs. Garcia to catch. The spell is broken, and Liam's hand slowly lowers back to his desk. The final bell of the day rings like a reprieve, and students flood the hallways with the desperate energy of prisoners granted parole. Liam takes his time at his locker, waiting for the initial rush to subside. He's learned that timing is everything. Leave too early, and you're caught in the chaos. Leave too late, and you're alone with the predators who linger. As he closes his locker and turns toward the exit, he nearly collides with Jake, who's leaning against the neighboring lockers with his signature smirk. "Rough day, trailer park?" he asks with false sympathy. "Don't worry, tomorrow's another chance to embarrass yourself." Liam looks at him for a long moment, really looks at him. Jake Morrison, future inheritor of Daddy's business empire, current king of a kingdom built on cruelty. What Jake doesn't know, what none of them know, is that Liam sees everything. Every insecurity masked by aggression, every moment of weakness hidden behind privilege, every crack in the armor they think makes them invincible. "Have a good afternoon, Jake," Liam says quietly, his voice carrying a note that Jake can't quite identify. Respect? Fear? Or something else entirely? Something that makes Jake's smirk falter for just a moment before sliding back into place. As Liam walks away, his worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor, Jake watches him go with a feeling he can't quite name. It's not satisfaction. That comes easy. It's something else, something that sits in his stomach like undigested food. For just a moment, looking into Liam's eyes, Jake had the strangest feeling that he was the one being studied, catalogued, filed away for future reference. But the moment passes, and Jake rejoins his friends, already planning tomorrow's entertainment. After all, Liam Matthews isn't going anywhere. He's predictable, controllable, the perfect victim in their perfect little ecosystem. What Jake doesn't know, what none of them know, is that some ecosystems are more fragile than they appear, and sometimes the quietest creatures are the ones that can bring the whole system crashing down. But that revelation is still waiting in the shadows, patient as death and twice as inevitable. The thing about predators is that they can smell weakness from 3 hallways away. They circle like sharks in bloodied water, testing boundaries, probing for that perfect moment when their prey is most vulnerable. At Hillcrest Middle School, Jake Morrison and his pack had turned cruelty into an art form, and Liam Matthews was their masterpiece. It started small, as these things always do, a shoulder bump in the hallway that sends books scattering across polished linoleum. An accidental spill of chocolate milk on a homework assignment 3 weeks in the making. A locker mysteriously jammed with gum, forcing Liam to arrive late to class while teachers tapped their feet impatiently and classmates snickered behind their hands. But small cruelties have a way of growing, feeding on themselves like cancerous cells until they become something monstrous and alive. What began as casual meanness evolved into systematic torture, orchestrated with the precision of military strategy and the callousness of sociopaths in training. Marcus Chen, Jake's lieutenant in this campaign of terror, had a particular talent for psychological warfare. He'd discovered that Liam carried a small photo in his wallet, his parents at their last anniversary dinner, both smiling at the camera with the kind of joy that made their tragedy even more heartbreaking. During gym class, while Liam was changing, Marcus had stolen the photo and made copies, passing them around with crude jokes about dead beats and trailer park trash. The humiliation cut deeper than any physical blow could have. Liam found the copies taped to his locker, stuffed in his textbooks, even slipped into his lunch tray by students who'd never spoken to him but were eager to participate in the spectacle of his degradation. Each discovery felt like watching his parents die all over again, their memory turned into a weapon against their own son. Tyler Brooks brought his own brand of cruelty to the group, the kind that came from growing up in a house where masculinity was measured in touchdowns and weakness was a cardinal sin. He'd started a rumor that Liam was weird, letting the implications hang in the air like a toxic cloud. In the brutal social mathematics of middle school, weird was worse than poor, worse than different, worse than almost anything else you could be. The rumors spread through the school's social networks like wildfire, mutating and growing with each retelling. Soon, Liam found himself completely isolated. Even the few neutral classmates who might have offered casual friendship now avoided him like he carried some contagious disease. Teachers, perhaps sensing the shift in social dynamics, seemed to look through him more than ever, their attention sliding away whenever he tried to participate in class discussions. But it was Jake who orchestrated the campaign's crescendo, turning bullying into performance art with an audience that grew more enthusiastic with each show. He'd started timing his attacks for maximum visibility, hallway intersections during passing periods, the cafeteria during lunch, the parking lot after school when parents arrived for pickup. Every humiliation was public, every moment of Liam's pain shared and amplified by dozens of witnesses. The verbal assaults became more creative, more pointed. Jake had done his research, learning about Liam's family situation with the thoroughness of a detective and the cruelty of a torturer. "Hey, Matthews," he'd call out across the cafeteria, "how's life in the Aluminum Palace? Your grandpa find a job yet? Or is he still living off government cheese?" The other students would laugh, not because it was funny, but because laughter was safer than silence, and silence might make you the next target. Liam learned to recognize the sound of that laughter, hollow and desperate, the sound of fear disguised as amusement. One particularly brutal afternoon in October, Jake had cornered Liam near the school's loading dock, an area technically off-limits to students, but conveniently blind to security cameras. Marcus and Tyler flanked him like bodyguards, while a small crowd of onlookers gathered at a safe distance, phones already out and recording. "You know what I heard?" Jake said conversationally, as if they were old friends catching up. "I heard your parents were drunk when they crashed. Like father, like son, right? Trash stays trash." The lie hit Liam like a physical blow. His parents had been killed by a drunk driver, not the other way around. But truth was irrelevant in moments like these. What mattered was the audience, the performance, the systematic destruction of whatever dignity Liam had left. "That's not true," Liam said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "What did you say?" Jake stepped closer, invading Liam's personal space with the practiced ease of someone who'd never had his own boundaries respected. "Speak up, Trailer Park. We can't hear you." "I said that's not true." Liam's voice was stronger now, but still quiet, still controlled. Around them, phones captured every word, every expression, preserving this moment of torment for posterity and social media. Jake smiled, the expression cold and predatory. "Are you calling me a liar?" He turned to his audience, arms spread wide like a performer acknowledging applause. "Did you guys hear that? Deadbeat Junior here thinks I'm a liar." The crowd stirred, sensing blood in the water. This was escalating beyond the usual verbal abuse, moving into territory that might finally provoke a reaction worth filming. Someone whispered, "Fight," and the word rippled through the gathered students like electricity. But Liam didn't fight. Instead, he did something worse. He looked directly into Jake's eyes and said, with perfect clarity and devastating calm, "I think you're exactly what everyone already knows you are." The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, Jake's facade cracked, revealing something raw and insecure underneath. He'd been expecting anger, tears, some reaction he could mock and diminish. Instead, he got truth, delivered with the kind of quiet dignity that made his own cruelty look small and desperate by comparison. The crowd held its breath, waiting for Jake's response. He couldn't let this stand. Not in front of his followers, not with cameras rolling, not when his entire identity was built on the foundation of others' fear. "You think you're better than me?" Jake's voice dropped to a whisper, more dangerous than any shout. "You think living in a tin can with your senile grandfather makes you special somehow?" He grabbed Liam's backpack and upended it, sending books, papers, and pencils scattering across the concrete. Among the debris was Liam's sketchpad, the one private space where he'd drawn his dreams, his plans, his escapes from the daily reality of his existence. Jake picked up the sketchpad and began flipping through it, his expression shifting from cruelty to something approaching confusion. The drawings were extraordinary, detailed technical schematics, architectural designs, intricate mechanical drawings that looked like they belonged in engineering textbooks rather than a middle schooler's notebook. "What is this garbage?" Jake said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. He held up a drawing of what appeared to be a complex computer system, cables and circuits rendered with photographic precision. "You building robots in your trailer, Matthews?" The crowd pressed closer, curious now rather than bloodthirsty. Someone reached for the sketchpad, wanting a better look, but Jake yanked it away possessively. This was his show, his moment of control. "Please," Liam said, stepping forward with his hand extended. "Give it back. Please," Jake mimicked in a high-pitched voice that bore no resemblance to Liam's actual tone. "Give it back." He tore out a page, a detailed drawing of a quantum computer interface that had taken Liam weeks to perfect, and held it up like evidence in a trial. "What's this supposed to be, your imaginary friend?" More pages followed, each one ripped from the binding with theatrical flourish. Months of work, years of dreams, scattered to the October wind like confetti. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence as Jake systematically destroyed something they didn't understand, but could recognize as precious. Liam stood frozen, watching his private world torn apart in public view. These weren't just drawings, they were his escape plans, his proof to himself that there was a world beyond Hillcrest Middle School where intelligence mattered more than ancestry, where problems had solutions, where he might finally find a place to belong. When the sketchpad was empty, Jake tossed the cover at Liam's feet. "There's your art project, Picasso. Maybe stick to finger painting next time." The crowd began to disperse, the show over, phones disappearing back into pockets. But the damage was done, not just to the sketchpad, but to something deeper. For the first time since his parents' death, Liam felt tears threatening to break through his carefully constructed walls. Marcus, perhaps sensing that they'd gone too far, touched Jake's arm. "Come on, man, we should go." But Jake wasn't finished. There was something in Liam's silence, in his refusal to break down completely, that unsettled him. He'd expected complete capitulation by now, total surrender. Instead, Liam just stood there, collecting his scattered belongings with methodical precision, his face revealing nothing. "Hey!" Jake said, his voice sharp with frustration. "I'm talking to you." Liam looked up from where he was gathering torn pages, and once again Jake saw something in those eyes that he couldn't quite identify. Not defeat, not yet. Something else, something that made him want to push harder, dig deeper, find the breaking point that had to exist somewhere beneath that infuriating calm. "Tomorrow," Jake said, loud enough for the remaining students to hear, "we're going to have another talk, and next time, Trailer Park, you better show me some respect." As the crowd finally dispersed and Jake's crew strutted away like conquering heroes, Liam remained on his knees, carefully collecting every torn piece of paper. Some were beyond saving, but others might be taped back together, restored to something resembling their original form. A shadow fell across him, and he looked up to see Sarah Henderson, a quiet girl from his history class who'd never spoken to him directly, but had always seemed different from the others. She knelt down and began helping him gather the scattered pages, her movements quick and furtive, as if afraid of being seen. "These are incredible," she whispered, holding up a partially torn drawing of a holographic display system. "Did you really draw all of these?" Liam nodded, not trusting his voice. It was the first genuine compliment he'd received from a classmate in longer than he could remember, and it hit him harder than any insult Jake had ever thrown. "You're going to be somebody important someday," Sarah said with quiet conviction. "Don't let them make you forget that." Then she was gone, disappearing into the afternoon crowd before he could thank her, leaving Liam alone with his scattered dreams and a single revolutionary thought. Maybe he wasn't as invisible as he'd believed. Maybe someone was watching, someone was listening, someone was waiting to see what he would become. But first, he had to survive what was coming next. Because Jake Morrison wasn't finished with him, not by a long shot. The performance had only whetted his appetite for destruction, and tomorrow would bring new opportunities for cruelty, new audiences for his twisted theater. What Jake didn't know was that every humiliation, every torn page, every moment of calculated cruelty was being stored away in a mind that forgot nothing and forgave even less. The quiet boy with the second-hand clothes and the worn-out sneakers was keeping score, and someday soon, the game would change completely. But for now, the predators still ruled the ecosystem, and their prey was learning lessons that would serve him well when the tables finally turned. There are moments in every person's life when the universe seems to pause, holding its breath while fate decides which direction a story will turn. For Liam Matthews, that moment came on a Tuesday in November, when the first snow of the season dusted the windows of Hillcrest Middle School like powdered glass, and Jake Morrison's cruelty finally found its perfect stage. The morning had started like any other, Liam navigating the hallways with practiced invisibility, his patched backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes focused on the middle distance to avoid unwanted contact. But there was something different in the air, an electric tension that made his skin prickle with unease. Jake and his crew were huddled near the main stairwell, their voices low, but their body language aggressive, like wolves planning a hunt. During third-period chemistry, while Mr. Rodriguez droned about molecular structures and chemical bonds, Liam found himself unable to concentrate. His mind kept drifting to the conversation he'd overheard that morning, fragments of planning, mentions of after lunch, and finally teach him, delivered in Jake's voice with an edge of anticipation that made Liam's stomach clench with dread. The cafeteria that day felt different too. The usual chaos of teenage voices seemed muted, as if the entire student body sensed that something significant was about to unfold. Liam sat at his usual table by the emergency exit, mechanically eating his peanut butter sandwich while his eyes tracked Jake's movements across the room. There was something theatrical about the way Jake held court at the popular table, gesturing broadly while his followers listened with rapt attention. When the lunch bell rang, signaling the transition to afternoon classes, Liam packed his belongings with extra care. Every instinct he'd developed over 3 years of survival was screaming danger, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Hillcrest Middle School had become a prison, and he was about to discover just how small his cell really was. The attack came between 4th and 5th period, in the narrow hallway that connected the math wing to the main building. It was perfectly planned, a corridor rarely used by teachers, isolated enough for privacy, but with enough foot traffic to ensure an audience. Jake appeared as if from nowhere, flanked by Marcus and Tyler, while other students began to gather at strategic points along the hallway, phones already activated and recording. Well, Jake said, his voice carrying that familiar note of false friendliness that had become the soundtrack to Liam's nightmares. "If it isn't our favorite artist, still drawing those little pictures, Matthews?" Liam tried to step around them, but Tyler moved to block his path, a wall of adolescent muscle and misplaced aggression. The hallway suddenly felt impossibly narrow, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing like angry insects. Students pressed closer, forming a loose circle that trapped Liam in the center, like a gladiator in an arena built for his destruction. "I asked you a question," Jake continued, stepping close enough that Liam could smell his expensive cologne. a scent that would forever after trigger memories of this moment. It's rude not to answer when someone's talking to you. I need to get to class, Liam said quietly, his voice steady despite the terror building in his chest. Around them, the crowd grew larger, drawn by that magnetic pull of impending violence that seems to activate something primitive in the human brain. "Class can wait," Marcus said, grinning with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found his calling in other people's misery. "We've got something special planned for you today, Matthews, a little field trip." That's when Liam saw the janitor's closet, a narrow door marked with a faded, authorized personnel only sign, its brass handle gleaming under the harsh hallway lighting. His blood turned to ice as he understood their intention. This wasn't just another public humiliation. This was something darker, more calculated, designed to break him in ways that words and torn sketches never could. "No," he said, the word escaping before he could stop it. It was barely a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the hallway it sounded like a shout. Jake's smile widened. "No! Did you just tell me no?" He turned to his audience, arms spread in theatrical disbelief. "Did everyone hear that? Deadbeat Junior thinks he gets to make the rules now." The crowd stirred, sensing blood in the water. Someone called out, "Do it!" while others urged caution, but their voices blurred together into a background hum of complicity and cowardice. Teachers were nowhere to be seen. They never were when things got serious, as if the adult world had collectively agreed to look the other way while children destroyed each other for sport. Liam tried to run then, his survival instincts finally overriding his paralyzed dignity, but Tyler was ready for him, grabbing his arm with bruising force and spinning him back toward the closet. Marcus took his other arm, and together they began dragging him toward the narrow door, while Jake produced a key. Where had he gotten a key? From his pocket. "Let me go," Liam said, his voice louder now, edged with panic. "Please, just let me go to class." But his pleas only energized his tormentors. This was what they'd been building toward all semester. The moment when quiet Liam Matthews would finally break, finally give them the reaction they'd been craving. The closet door swung open, revealing a narrow space filled with mops, buckets, and the chemical smell of industrial cleaning supplies. "Time for some alone time, Trailer Park," Jake said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Maybe when you come out, you'll remember how to show proper respect." They shoved him inside with the casual brutality of practiced predators. Liam stumbled over a bucket, his hands scraping against rough concrete walls as he tried to catch himself. The space was impossibly small, barely wider than his outstretched arms, maybe 6 feet deep. Shelves lined both walls, creating a narrow corridor that felt more like a coffin than a room. The door slammed shut with a sound like thunder, followed by the decisive click of the lock engaging. Suddenly, Liam was alone in absolute darkness, the kind of profound black that makes you question whether your eyes are open or closed. The silence was deafening. No voices, no footsteps, no evidence that the outside world still existed. He pounded on the door immediately, his fists striking the metal surface with hollow, echoing blows. "Let me out," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please, somebody help me." But there was no response, no indication that anyone was listening. The hallway had emptied as quickly as it had filled, students dispersing to their next classes with the practiced efficiency of witnesses who'd learned that seeing nothing was safer than getting involved. Even Jake's crew had vanished, their entertainment complete, leaving their victim trapped like an animal in a cage. The darkness pressed against Liam's eyes like a living thing, making his other senses hyper-aware of every sound, every smell, every sensation. The chemical odor of bleach and ammonia burned his nostrils, while the concrete walls seemed to pulse with a cold that seeped through his thin jacket and into his bones. Time became meaningless. Minutes felt like hours, hours like eternities. He tried calling for help again, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. But the walls were thick, the closet tucked away in a forgotten corner of the building where foot traffic was minimal. His shouts were swallowed by the darkness, lost in the vast indifference of an institution that had already written him off. Panic began to set in, real panic, the kind that makes thinking impossible and breathing difficult. His chest felt tight, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape. The walls seemed to be closing in, the ceiling pressing down, the floor rising up to meet him. Claustrophobia, he realized with clinical detachment, even as his rational mind began to fragment under the assault of terror. He slumped against the door, sliding down until he was sitting on the cold concrete floor with his knees drawn up to his chest. The darkness was complete, absolute, more profound than anything he'd experienced since childhood nightmares. But this wasn't a dream. This was real, and there was no guarantee that anyone would come looking for him before the building emptied for the day. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. In the darkness, time lost all meaning. Liam's throat grew raw from calling for help, his fists bloody from pounding on the unforgiving door. The cold seeped deeper into his bones, making him shiver uncontrollably, despite his efforts to stay warm. But somewhere in the depths of his despair, something unexpected began to happen. As his panic subsided and his breathing steadied, Liam's mind started to work again. Not the scattered, terrified thinking of a trapped animal, but the methodical, analytical process that had always been his greatest strength. He began to catalogue his surroundings by touch, his fingers exploring the confined space with scientific precision. Shelves here, filled with supplies. A mop bucket there, wheels that squeaked when moved. The door itself, metal, solid, but with hinges on this side that might be vulnerable to the right kind of pressure. More importantly, he began to think about the system that had brought him here. Jake's planning, the coordination required, the key that had materialized at exactly the right moment. This wasn't random cruelty. It was organized, systematic, a campaign of terror that had escalated to this inevitable conclusion. And in that realization, something crystallized in Liam's mind. Not revenge. That was too simple, too immediate, but understanding. A complete, comprehensive map of the social ecosystem that had made this moment possible, and more importantly, a blueprint for dismantling it from within. The darkness that had seemed like an enemy began to feel like an ally, a cocoon where transformation could take place unseen and undisturbed. Liam Matthews, the quiet victim who'd absorbed years of abuse without retaliation, was dying in this closet. What would emerge when the door finally opened was something different, something harder, clearer, infinitely more dangerous than his tormentors could possibly imagine. Outside, the school day continued its predictable rhythm. Teachers taught their lessons, students attended their classes, and the administrative machinery of education ground forward with mechanical indifference. But in the darkness of a forgotten closet, a revolution was being born. Quietly, invisibly, with the patience of someone who'd learned that the most devastating attacks come from directions no one thinks to guard. When the janitor finally found him 4 hours later, alerted by an anonymous tip that investigators would never trace, Liam was sitting calmly in the darkness, his back straight, his breathing steady. He didn't cry when the door opened. He didn't collapse or scream or show any of the reactions his rescuer expected. Instead, he simply stood up, dusted off his clothes, and walked out into the hallway light with the quiet dignity of someone who'd discovered something important about himself in the depths of his darkest hour. The boy who'd been shoved into that closet was gone forever. What walked out was something entirely new, and Jake Morrison's world was about to discover just how dangerous underestimating the quiet ones could be. The trailer door creaked on its hinges as Liam stepped inside, the familiar sound now carrying weight it had never held before. 4 hours in darkness had changed him in ways that weren't immediately visible. The same worn sneakers, the same patched backpack, the same quiet demeanor that had made him invisible for so long. But something fundamental had shifted in the space between his ribs, something that made the very air feel different against his skin. Harold Matthews looked up from his recliner, where he'd been reading a dog-eared copy of Popular Mechanics through reading glasses held together with electrical tape. At 72, Harold had the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent working with his hands, deep lines etched by prairie winds, calluses that told stories of honest labor, eyes that had seen enough of the world to recognize when something important had happened. "You're late," he said, not accusingly, but with the gentle concern of someone who'd learned that small changes often preceded big revelations. "Everything all right at school?" Liam set his backpack down carefully, each movement deliberate and controlled. "How do you explain to your grandfather that you've spent the afternoon trapped in a closet, that the last vestiges of your childhood had died in industrial darkness, that you've finally understood the true nature of the war being waged against you?" "Just had to stay after for something," Liam said, the lies sliding off his tongue with surprising ease. He'd protected Harold from the worst of the bullying, editing his daily reports to spare the old man's heart. What would be the point of adding this latest cruelty to his grandfather's collection of worries? But Harold Matthews had raised 3 children and buried a son. He could read between lines that hadn't even been written yet. He studied his grandson's face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that the most important conversations often began with the smallest observations. "That something have anything to do with why your knuckles are scraped?" Harold asked, setting aside his magazine, "or why you've got that look in your eyes?" Liam glanced down at his hands, surprised to see the evidence of his desperate battle against the closet door. In the darkness, he'd been aware of the pain, but not the damage, his body operating on autopilot while his mind wrestled with larger questions. Now, in the warm light of the trailer's living room, the raw skin seemed to tell a story he wasn't ready to share. "Grandfather," Liam said, settling into the worn couch across from Harold's chair, "can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "When Dad was my age, did anyone ever give him trouble?" Harold's expression shifted, clouds passing across the landscape of his weathered features. He removed his glasses and cleaned them with a methodical precision that suggested he was buying time to choose his words carefully. "Your father," Harold said finally, "was a lot like you. Quiet, thoughtful, saw things differently than most folks. And yes, there were boys who thought that made him an easy target. What did he do about it?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to a framed photograph on the side table. David Matthews at 17, graduation cap askew, grinning at the camera with the kind of joy that made his later tragedy even more heartbreaking. First time someone pushed him around, David came home with a black eye and a bloody nose. Wanted to know why some people seem to need to hurt others to feel good about themselves. Harold's voice carried the weight of memory, of conversations held decades ago, but never forgotten. "I told him the same thing my father told me, that some folks are born with holes in their hearts, and they spend their whole lives trying to fill those holes by emptying other people." Liam leaned forward, something in his grandfather's tone suggesting there was more to this story. "But that's not all you told him, is it?" A smile ghosted across Harold's lips, there and gone like morning mist. "Smart boy." "No, that wasn't all." He stood up slowly, his arthritis making the movement careful and deliberate, and walked to a closet Liam had never seen him open. From the depths of winter coats and forgotten boxes, Harold withdrew something wrapped in an old canvas tarp. "Your father," Harold said, settling the bundle on the coffee table between them, "had a gift. Just like you do." The tarp fell away to reveal what looked like the guts of a dozen different electronic devices, circuit boards, cables, processors, screens, all connected in a complex web that seemed to pulse with hidden purpose. It was clearly handmade, assembled with the kind of meticulous care that suggested both deep knowledge and profound patience. "What is it?" Liam asked, though something in his mind was already beginning to piece together the answer. "Your father built this when he was 16, Harold said, running his fingers along one of the circuit boards with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Called it his truth machine. Back then, computers were room-sized monsters that only universities could afford. But David, he saw the future coming, saw what these things could do, how they could level playing fields that had been tilted in favor of bullies and bigots for generations. Liam stared at the device, his mind racing. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Cables routed with military precision, soldering joints that looked like tiny works of art, programming interfaces that suggested capabilities far beyond anything that should have been possible with 1980s technology. "He never got to finish it," Harold continued, his voice growing soft. "College came, then marriage, then you, then—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The drunk driver who'd taken David and Sarah Matthews had also stolen this remarkable machine's chance to change the world. "But you," Harold said, looking directly into his grandson's eyes, "you have the same gift, maybe even stronger. I've seen you fix things that should have been beyond repair, understand systems that grown men struggle with. You think I don't know about the computer you built from spare parts, the programs you write on that ancient laptop when you think I'm asleep?" Liam felt something shift in his chest, a recognition so profound it was almost physical. All these years, he'd thought his interests were strange, his abilities irrelevant to the brutal social realities of middle school. But looking at his father's unfinished work, he began to understand that he'd inherited more than just David Matthews's quiet demeanor. He'd inherited a legacy of innovation, a birthright of technological brilliance that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. "The boys who gave your father trouble," Harold said, carefully rewrapping the device. "They thought they were picking on some helpless kid. What they didn't understand was that they were poking a sleeping giant. Your father never got his revenge. He was too kind for that, too focused on building things up instead of tearing them down. But you—" Harold paused, studying his grandson's face with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "You've got your father's brilliance, but you've also got something he never had. You've got anger, real anger, the kind that can fuel creation as much as destruction. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Liam thought about the closet, about Jake's smirk as the door slammed shut, about 4 hours of darkness that had burned away the last of his childhood illusions. He thought about his torn sketches, his humiliated dignity, his parents' memory turned into weapons against their own son. "I want to learn," he said quietly. "Everything, not just computers but systems, how they work, how they connect, how they can be influenced." Harold nodded slowly, as if this was the answer he'd been hoping to hear. "Your father's workshop is still set up in the shed out back. Been waiting for someone to use it properly. Tools, books, components, everything a young engineer might need to build whatever his mind can conceive." "And if I built something," Liam asked, his voice carefully neutral, "something that could change things at school, make certain people understand that actions have consequences, would that be wrong?" Harold was quiet for a long time, staring at the place where his son's unfinished masterpiece had rested moments before. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom and carefully considered judgment. "Your father used to say that technology is just a tool, no more moral or immoral than a hammer or a pencil. What matters is the hand that guides it and the heart that motivates that hand." He looked directly at Liam, his eyes sharp despite his age. "Those boys have been trying to break you for months. They locked you in a closet today like you were some kind of animal. Maybe it's time they learned that some animals bite back, The conversation that followed lasted deep into the night. Grandfather and grandson hunched over technical manuals and circuit diagrams, sharing knowledge that had been accumulating in the Matthews family for generations. Harold told stories of David's innovations, his breakthroughs, his dreams of using technology to solve problems that seemed insurmountable. But more importantly, he began teaching Liam about systems. Not just electronic ones, but social systems, institutional systems, the invisible networks of power and influence that determined who rose and who fell in communities like theirs. Every organization, he explained, from middle schools to multinational corporations, operated according to predictable patterns. And patterns, once understood, could be manipulated by someone with the right knowledge and the right tools. As the hours passed, Liam felt something awakening inside him, not just understanding, but purpose. For years, he'd been a passive victim, absorbing cruelty without retaliation, accepting his place at the bottom of the social hierarchy. But sitting in his grandfather's living room, surrounded by the tools and wisdom of his father's legacy, he began to see himself differently. He wasn't just Liam Matthews, the quiet kid from the trailer park. He was the inheritor of a tradition of innovation, the keeper of knowledge that could reshape the very foundations of the world that had tried to destroy him. Jake Morrison and his crew thought they were picking on some helpless victim, but they had no idea what they'd actually awakened. By dawn, the transformation was complete. The boy who'd been shoved into a closet the day before was gone, replaced by something harder, clearer, infinitely more dangerous. Liam Matthews was ready to go to war, not with fists or angry words, but with the most powerful weapons he could imagine. Knowledge, patience, and the kind of technological brilliance that could turn entire systems against themselves. The predators at Hillcrest Middle School had no idea what was coming, but they were about to learn that sometimes the quietest prey makes the most devastating predator. And somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, Harold Matthews smiled, knowing that his son's legacy was finally in the right hands. The morning of the assembly, November snow still clung to the windows of Hillcrest Middle School like crystallized tears. But inside the auditorium, the air thrummed with anticipation for all the wrong reasons. Principal Davidson stood at the podium, tapping the microphone with the kind of bureaucratic confidence that comes from years of managing teenagers who'd rather be anywhere else. The monthly character-building assembly was a tradition as predictable as cafeteria mystery meat, usually featuring guest speakers who specialized in inspiring apathy. Liam sat in the back row, as always, his presence so unremarkable that even the teacher's eyes seemed to slide past him without pause. But something was different today, a stillness about him that went deeper than his usual quiet demeanor. 2 weeks had passed since the closet incident, 2 weeks of late nights in his father's workshop, 2 weeks of preparation that had transformed not just his understanding of technology, but his understanding of himself. Today's presentation, Principal Davidson announced, his voice echoing off the auditorium's acoustic tiles, is about the importance of digital literacy in the modern world. Our guest speaker from the district office will be sharing some exciting developments in educational technology. The district representative, a thin man in an expensive suit who clearly viewed this assignment as a necessary evil, connected his laptop to the school's aging projection system with the kind of theatrical confidence that suggested he'd done this presentation dozens of times before. Students settled into their seats with the resigned patience of prisoners watching a familiar movie for the 100th time. But technology, as Liam had learned from his grandfather, doesn't care about confidence or preparation. It operates according to its own immutable laws, responding to understanding rather than authority, and understanding was something Liam Matthews possessed in abundance. The first sign of trouble came when the projector's cooling fan began making an irregular whirring sound, like a mechanical creature learning to breathe. The district representative frowned, tapping keys on his laptop with increasing urgency as his carefully prepared slides refused to display properly. Minutes ticked by while he fiddled with connections and settings, his professional composure beginning to crack under the weight of 600 teenage eyes watching his competence crumble in real time. "Technical difficulties," Principal Davidson announced with the forced cheer of someone accustomed to institutional failures. "These things happen. Perhaps we could—" The projector died with a sound like electronic death, its lamp flickering once before surrendering to darkness. The district representative stared at his laptop screen in bewilderment, clicking frantically on icons that might as well have been hieroglyphics for all the response they generated. Murmurs rippled through the auditorium as students began to sense the possibility of an unexpected reprieve from educational torture. In the back row, Jake Morrison leaned over to Marcus Chen with a smirk that could have cut glass. "Typical," he whispered, just loud enough for the surrounding students to hear. "Can't even make their own technology work. What do they expect from trailer park schools?" But Liam wasn't listening to Jake's commentary. His attention was focused entirely on the failing system, his mind automatically cataloging the symptoms and identifying the root cause with the kind of diagnostic precision that came from years of fixing broken things with his grandfather. This wasn't random mechanical failure. This was a cascade of interconnected problems that could be solved by someone who understood both the hardware and the software involved. Principal Davidson was conferring with the district representative in hushed, urgent tones when Liam stood up. The movement was so unexpected, so unprecedented, that conversations died in widening circles around him like ripples on a disturbed pond. Students who hadn't looked directly at him in months suddenly found their attention drawn to the quiet boy in the back row who was walking toward the stage with purpose. "Excuse me," Liam said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's acoustic design. Not loud, not demanding attention, but somehow impossible to ignore. "I think I can help." Principal Davidson looked up with the kind of expression usually reserved for discovering that your car's engine has spontaneously caught fire. "Mr. Matthews, this really isn't—" "The projector's video input controller is overheating," Liam continued, climbing the steps to the stage with steady confidence. "It's causing a feedback loop in the display drivers. The cooling fan failure is a symptom, not the cause. The real problem is in the software interface between the laptop and the projection system." The district representative stared at him as if he'd begun speaking in ancient Sumerian. "I'm sorry, young man, but this is sophisticated equipment. I don't think—" Liam was already kneeling beside the projector, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he examined connections and settings that the adult expert had overlooked. "The software is trying to push a signal that the hardware can't process properly. But if we bypass the automatic detection protocol and manually configure the output parameters—" His fingers flew across keyboard shortcuts that most adults had never heard of, navigating through system menus with the kind of fluid expertise that suggested intimate familiarity with technology's deepest mysteries. The auditorium fell completely silent, 600 students and 24 teachers watching in fascination as the weird kid from the trailer park casually solved a problem that had defeated a district technology specialist. The projector hummed back to life with a sound like mechanical resurrection. But instead of displaying the district representative's boring slides about digital literacy, the screen filled with something extraordinary. A three-dimensional holographic interface that seemed to float in mid-air, rotating slowly to display different angles of what appeared to be a complex architectural structure. Gasps echoed through the auditorium as students leaned forward in their seats, trying to understand what they were seeing. The image was impossibly detailed, photorealistic in its precision, with lighting effects and shadow rendering that belonged in a Hollywood movie rather than a middle school assembly. Text floated alongside the structure, explaining its function as a next-generation data center designed for quantum computing applications. "This is," the district representative stammered, his eyes wide with amazement. Where did this come from?" Liam stood up slowly, his quiet confidence radiating outward like heat from a fire. "I designed it," he said simply. "The building, the interface, the rendering engine, all of it, it's part of a larger project I've been working on." The silence that followed was so complete, it seemed to have weight. Teachers exchanged glances that spoke of paradigm shifts and rewritten assumptions. Students who had dismissed Liam as irrelevant were suddenly seeing him with entirely new eyes. Even Jake Morrison's perpetual smirk had frozen on his face like a mask that no longer fit properly. Principal Davidson found his voice first. "Mr. Matthews, this is remarkable. How long have you been working on something like this?" "About 3 years." Liam replied, his hands still moving across the keyboard as new images appeared on screen. Circuit designs, programming interfaces, architectural blueprints that belonged in graduate-level engineering courses. "Since my parents died, actually. It started as a way to keep my mind occupied, but it's become something more." The auditorium erupted into whispered conversations as students tried to process what they were witnessing. The weird kid, the outcast, the victim they'd all written off as beneath notice, was casually displaying technological abilities that surpassed anything they'd imagined possible. This wasn't just fixing a broken projector. This was proof of genius, raw and undeniable. But Liam wasn't finished. With a few more keystrokes, the display shifted to show a real-time simulation of network traffic flowing through the school's computer systems. Students could see their own phones connecting to Wi-Fi, their social media activity represented as streams of light flowing through digital pathways that Liam had mapped with surgical precision. "The thing about systems," Liam said, his voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium, "is that they're only as strong as their weakest connection. Most people see technology as magic, but it's really just logic made visible. Once you understand the logic, you can rebuild the magic." Jake Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, something cold and unfamiliar settling in his stomach. For months, he'd tormented the quiet boy in the back row, secure in the knowledge that Liam was powerless, friendless, unable to fight back. But watching those impossible images dance across the screen, seeing the respectful attention Liam was commanding from an audience that had never noticed him before, Jake began to understand that he might have misjudged the situation entirely. The district representative was taking notes frantically, his earlier condescension replaced by professional excitement. "Mr. Matthews, have you considered applying to specialized programs? There are academies that would be very interested in someone with your abilities." "Actually," Liam said, pulling a folded letter from his back pocket, "I received this yesterday." He handed the letter to Principal Davidson, who read it with increasing amazement before looking up at Liam with something approaching awe. "Ladies and gentlemen," the principal announced, his voice carrying a note of pride that surprised everyone, especially himself, "Mr. Matthews has been offered a full scholarship to the Westmont Institute for Advanced Sciences. It's one of the most prestigious technical academies in the country." The applause that followed started slowly, uncertain, but built into something genuine and sustained. Students who had never spoken to Liam were clapping with real enthusiasm, caught up in the magic of witnessing true excellence emerge from the most unexpected source. Teachers were nodding approvingly, already rewriting their mental files on the quiet boy they'd overlooked for so long. But in the center of it all, Liam remained perfectly calm, his expression revealing nothing of the transformation that had brought him to this moment. He accepted the applause with quiet dignity, neither celebrating nor gloating, simply acknowledging the recognition as something long overdue. As the assembly concluded and students began filing out of the auditorium, conversations buzzed with excitement and disbelief. The weird kid from the trailer park had just demonstrated abilities that most of them couldn't even comprehend, had revealed depths of talent that made their own accomplishments seem trivial by comparison. Jake Morrison remained in his seat long after his friends had left, staring at the empty stage where Liam Matthews had just rewritten the entire social order of Hillcrest Middle School. The boy he'd tormented for months wasn't who he'd thought he was, wasn't who anyone had thought he was. And as Jake finally stood to leave, walking past the spot where Liam had knelt to repair the projector, he felt something he'd never experienced before: the cold, uncomfortable weight of having underestimated an opponent who had been planning his own quiet revolution all along. The war between them wasn't over. It was just beginning. But the battlefield had changed completely, and Jake was starting to realize that he might be fighting for the losing side. The first video appeared on social media exactly 37 minutes after the assembly ended, uploaded by Madison Torres from her phone with shaky hands and a caption that read, "OMG, you guys need to see this." The quiet kid just broke the internet. Within an hour, it had been shared 43 times. By dinner, the number had climbed into the hundreds. By midnight, Liam Matthews had become something he'd never imagined possible: viral. The footage wasn't professional, shot from the third row with the kind of amateur camera work that made viewers seasick, but the content was undeniable. There was Liam, kneeling beside the broken projector with the calm confidence of someone solving a simple math problem. There was the moment when impossible images filled the screen, three-dimensional holograms that seemed to defy the laws of physics and technology. And there was the stunned silence of 600 students witnessing the birth of a legend. Comments began flooding in from accounts across the country, then across the world. Tech journalists who specialized in debunking viral hoaxes found themselves unable to explain what they were seeing. Computer science professors forwarded the video to colleagues with subject lines like, "Is this even possible?" and "We need to talk about this kid." Silicon Valley venture capitalists began making phone calls to anyone who might have contact information for a middle school in rural nowhere. But the most important calls came from places Liam had only dreamed of reaching: Google's Youth Recruitment Division, MIT's Early Admission Program, NASA's Student Internship Coordinator. Companies and institutions that normally dealt with college graduates and PhD candidates were suddenly very interested in having a conversation with a 14-year-old from a trailer park. Principal Davidson's phone rang for the first time at 11:23 p.m., jerking him awake from dreams of retirement and faculty meetings. The caller identified himself as Dr. Richard Chen, Director of Student Recruitment for the California Institute of Technology. "I apologize for the late hour," Dr. Chen said, his voice carrying the kind of urgency usually reserved for medical emergencies. "But I've just watched a video that I believe features one of your students, a Mr. Liam Matthews." Principal Davidson sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. "Yes, Liam is one of our students. May I ask what this is about?" "Mr. Davidson, I've been recruiting exceptional students for 15 years. I've seen child prodigies who could solve differential equations in their sleep and teenagers who built functioning robots in their garages. But what I witnessed in that video, the holographic rendering, the real-time network analysis, the interface design..." Dr. Chen paused, as if struggling to find words adequate to his amazement. "I need to speak with this young man immediately." The conversation that followed lasted 47 minutes and covered topics that Principal Davidson had never imagined discussing: early graduation options, accelerated degree programs, research opportunities that sounded more like science fiction than education. By the time he hung up, 3 more calls were waiting: Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, and something called the Advanced Technology Institute that claimed to be affiliated with the Department of Defense. Meanwhile, in the Matthews family trailer, Liam sat at his computer watching the numbers climb with a mixture of fascination and concern. He'd anticipated that the assembly would create some ripples within the school's social ecosystem, but this tsunami of attention was beyond anything he'd calculated. His carefully planned revelation was spreading far beyond his intended audience, attracting interest from corners of the world he wasn't prepared to navigate. Harold Matthews emerged from his bedroom in a threadbare robe, drawn by the unusual glow of multiple computer screens and the constant ping of incoming notifications. "Everything all right, son?" Liam turned the laptop screen toward his grandfather, showing a Twitter feed that was updating faster than human eyes could follow. "I think we might have a problem." Harold squinted at the scrolling text, his aging eyes struggling to process the digital chaos. "What am I looking at?" "The assembly this morning. Someone recorded it and posted it online. It's been shared about 15,000 times in the last 6 hours." Liam's voice carried a note of wonder mixed with worry. "People are calling it everything from a hoax to proof of alien technology. Tech companies are trying to figure out how to contact me." And he paused, staring at a particularly surreal comment thread. "Someone started a conspiracy theory that I'm actually a government experiment." Harold was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications of his grandson's sudden fame. Then unexpectedly he began to chuckle, a sound that built into full-throated laughter that seemed to surprise them both. "Your father would have gotten such a kick out of this," Harold said, wiping tears from his eyes. "All those years he worried about people not understanding his work, not seeing the potential in what he was building. And here you are, showing the whole world what a Matthews can do when they put their mind to it." But Liam's attention had shifted to a new notification, an email that made his breath catch in his throat. The sender was listed as TechCrunch editorial, and the subject line read, "Interview request, the genius of Hillcrest Middle School." "Grandfather," Liam said quietly, "I think everything just changed." The article went live at 6 a.m. Eastern Time with a headline that captured the internet's imagination. 14-year-old student casually demonstrates technology that shouldn't exist. The piece was written by Sarah Kim, TechCrunch's senior education correspondent, who had spent most of the night researching holographic displays, real-time network analysis, and the theoretical limits of what a single teenager could accomplish with consumer-grade equipment. Her conclusion was both simple and revolutionary. Either this was the most sophisticated hoax in internet history, or Liam Matthews represented a paradigm shift in human technological capability. The article included frame-by-frame analysis of the viral video, expert commentary from MIT and Stanford professors, and a sidebar exploring the implications of advanced AI being developed by minors without institutional oversight. By 8 a.m., the story had been picked up by CNN, BBC, and a dozen other major news outlets. By 10 a.m., it was trending on every social platform simultaneously. By noon, a news van was parked outside Hillcrest Middle School, and reporters were interviewing students about the boy genius who had apparently been hiding in plain sight for years. Jake Morrison watched the coverage from his family's breakfast nook, his expensive cereal growing soggy as his worldview crumbled like a house of cards in an earthquake. The local news anchor was describing Liam as a technological prodigy whose abilities may represent the future of human innovation. The same Liam that Jake had shoved into a closet just 2 weeks earlier. The same Liam whose sketches he'd torn up and whose dignity he'd systematically destroyed for months. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't been bullying some helpless victim. He'd been attacking someone whose intelligence and capabilities made his own accomplishments look like finger painting. Every cruel joke, every moment of humiliation, every casual act of cruelty had been directed at someone who could have destroyed him a dozen different ways, but had chosen not to. The fear that followed was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. This wasn't the normal anxiety of teenage social dynamics. This was the bone-deep terror of realizing you've made an enemy of someone whose power you can't even comprehend. If Liam could create holographic displays and hack network systems, What else could he do? What else had he been planning while Jake was busy playing king of a sandbox? Marcus Chen found Jake staring at his phone in the school parking lot, refreshing news articles with the compulsive desperation of someone hoping reality might change if he looked at it enough times. "Dude, this is insane," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of nervous excitement. "Did you know? Did you have any idea that Matthews was some kind of super genius?" Jake looked up at his friend, his accomplice, his fellow predator, and saw his own fear reflected in Marcus's eyes. They'd all participated in the systematic torment of someone who was apparently destined for greatness, someone whose name would probably appear in history books, while theirs were forgotten entirely. "We need to apologize," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Before this gets any bigger, before anyone connects us to, the closet thing, we need to make this right." But Jake was already shaking his head, something cold and calculating replacing the initial shock. "No," he said quietly. "Apologizing now would just draw attention to what we did. Make it look like we're only sorry because he turned out to be important. Then what do we do?" Jake stared across the parking lot toward the building where he'd reigned as unchallenged king for so many months. "We stay quiet, act normal, and hope he's too busy being famous to remember what happened before." What Jake didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Liam Matthews forgot nothing. Every humiliation, every cruelty, every moment of calculated meanness had been carefully catalogued and stored in a mind that operated like a computer, processing information with mechanical precision and infinite patience. The viral fame was gratifying, the recognition long overdue, the opportunities beyond his wildest dreams. But none of that changed the fundamental equation that had been building toward resolution for months. Jake Morrison and his crew had declared war on someone they'd assumed was defenseless. Now they were about to discover what happened when their victim finally decided to fight back. And unlike their crude, immediate cruelties, Liam's revenge would be subtle, surgical, and absolutely devastating. The world was watching now, which meant everything that happened next would be remembered forever. Jake Morrison had no idea that his entire future was about to be rewritten by the quiet boy whose present he'd tried so hard to destroy. The first thing Jake Morrison noticed when he arrived at school the next morning was the silence. Not the normal pre-class chatter that usually filled the hallways, but something deeper, the kind of hushed anticipation that precedes either miracles or disasters. Students moved in tight clusters, their voices dropping to whispers whenever they spotted him, their eyes carrying a knowledge that made his skin crawl with unspecified dread. The second thing he noticed was the way teachers looked at him. Mrs. Peterson, who'd always greeted him with the warm favoritism reserved for students whose parents made generous donations to the school district, now watched him with something approaching wariness. Mr. Rodriguez nodded politely, but without his usual enthusiasm. Even the janitor seemed to study Jake with new interest, as if seeing him for the first time. But it was the sight of Liam Matthews that stopped Jake cold in the hallway outside his first period classroom. Liam stood at his locker with the same quiet composure he'd always possessed, but everything else had changed. Students who'd never acknowledged his existence were gathered around him, their faces animated with genuine interest, as they peppered him with questions about programming languages and engineering principles. Sarah Henderson from the debate team was asking about quantum computing theory. Trevor Walsh, who'd mocked Liam's sketches just weeks earlier, was now requesting help with his computer science homework. Most unsettling of all, Liam was answering their questions with patient courtesy, explaining complex concepts in terms his peers could understand, treating everyone with the same respectful attention, regardless of how they'd treated him before. There was no trace of bitterness in his voice, no hint of revenge in his manner, just the calm confidence of someone who'd finally found his proper place in the world. When Liam's eyes met Jake's across the crowded hallway, Something passed between them that made Jake's chest tighten with inexplicable fear, not anger. That would have been easier to process. Instead, Liam simply nodded, a gesture so polite and neutral that it felt more threatening than any glare could have been. "Jake!" The voice belonged to Principal Davidson, who was approaching with the kind of purposeful stride that usually preceded uncomfortable conversations. "Could I see you in my office for a moment?" The walk down the administrative hallway felt like a death march, each step echoing off polished linoleum that seemed to amplify Jake's growing anxiety. Principal Davidson's office, normally a sanctuary where Jake's family connections granted him immunity from serious consequences, now felt like a courtroom where he was about to face judgment for crimes he couldn't even name. "Sit down, Jake," Principal Davidson said, closing the door with deliberate care. "We need to talk." The principal settled behind his desk, his expression unreadable as he opened a manila folder that seemed unnaturally thick. "I've been having some interesting conversations over the past 24 hours. Reporters mostly, asking about Mr. Matthews and his time here at Hillcrest. They're working on follow-up stories about his background, his experiences, what shaped him into the remarkable young man we saw yesterday." Jake's mouth went dry. "Okay. The thing is," Principal Davidson continued, his voice carrying a note of careful neutrality, "several people have mentioned that Mr. Matthews faced some challenges from his peers. Social difficulties that may have contributed to his desire to keep his abilities hidden." The manila folder opened, revealing a collection of photographs that made Jake's blood turn to ice. Screenshots from social media, security camera stills from school hallways, images that chronicled months of systematic cruelty with the precision of a criminal investigation. "This one's particularly interesting," Principal Davidson said, sliding a photograph across the desk. It showed Jake and his crew surrounding Liam near the loading dock, phones visible in the background, the moment frozen just before they'd torn up his sketches, posted on Instagram with the caption, "Trailer trash gets schooled." The timestamp shows it was taken just 3 weeks ago. Jake stared at the image, his reflection captured in the act of casual cruelty, his face animated with the kind of malicious joy that looked monstrous when viewed through the lens of current events. "Sir, I can explain." "Oh, I'm sure you can," Principal Davidson interrupted, his voice hardening. "I'm sure you have all sorts of explanations for why you and your friends thought it was appropriate to torment someone who's now being called one of the most promising young minds in the country." More photographs followed, each one a damning piece of evidence in a case Jake hadn't realized was being built against him. The progression was clear. Months of escalating harassment documented by witnesses who'd been too afraid or too entertained to intervene at the time, but were now eager to share their evidence with investigators. "The reporters haven't published these yet," Principal Davidson said, gathering the photographs back into their folder. "They're still fact-checking, still building their narrative. But Jake, when this story breaks, and it will break, every news outlet in the country is going to want to know how America's newest genius was treated by his classmates." The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. This wasn't just about school discipline anymore. This was about national media attention, about having his face associated with the persecution of someone the entire world was now celebrating. His family's reputation, his college prospects, his entire future could be destroyed by photographs that would live forever on the internet. What do I need to do?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Principal Davidson leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for complex problems requiring delicate solutions. "That's up to you, Jake. But I'd suggest you think very carefully about how you want this story to end." The bell rang, signaling the end of first period, but Jake remained frozen in his chair. Through the principal's window, he could see students moving between classes with the normal chaos of institutional transition. But everything felt different now, as if he were watching the world through glass that distorted familiar shapes into something alien and threatening. When he finally emerged from the administrative office, Jake found Marcus and Tyler waiting near his locker, their faces pale with the kind of fear that comes from watching your carefully constructed world begin to collapse. "Dude, we need to talk," Marcus said, his voice urgent with barely controlled panic. "My mom just called. She saw the news story about Matthews, and she's asking questions about whether I know him, whether there's anything she should be aware of." Tyler nodded frantically. "Same here. My dad's already talking about transferring me to private school if there's any chance I'll be connected to this mess. He says having my name associated with bullying could affect my athletic scholarships." Jake looked at his friends, his accomplices, his fellow architects of Liam Matthews' systematic humiliation, and realized that their small, cruel kingdom was already crumbling. The power structure that had seemed so permanent, so natural, was revealing itself to be nothing more than a house of cards built on the assumption that their victims would remain powerless forever. "We have to apologize," Marcus continued, "publicly, genuinely, before someone connects the dots and realizes what we did to him." But even as his friends planned their desperate damage control, Jake found his attention drawn to something else entirely. Across the hallway, near the scene of their greatest cruelty, Liam Matthews was calmly explaining holographic projection theory to a group of fascinated classmates. There was something in his manner, a patience, a kindness, that made Jake's previous assumptions about revenge seem suddenly naive. What if Liam wasn't planning some elaborate retaliation? What if his response to months of systematic cruelty was simply to rise above it? To become so successful and admired that his tormentors became irrelevant by comparison? The possibility was somehow more terrifying than any direct confrontation could have been, because if Liam Matthews simply ignored them, if he treated their past cruelties as beneath his notice, then Jake and his friends would be left with nothing but the knowledge of what they'd done, and the growing certainty that the entire world would soon know it too. As Jake watched Liam patiently answer another question about quantum computing, he realized that the quiet boy from the trailer park had already achieved the most devastating revenge possible. He'd made his tormentors invisible while becoming impossible to ignore himself. The war was over. Jake just hadn't realized he'd already lost. And in the growing circle of students around Liam Matthews, hanging on his every word with genuine respect and admiration, Jake caught a glimpse of what his own future might have looked like if he'd chosen kindness over cruelty, curiosity over dominance, collaboration over conquest. But that future belonged to someone else now. All Jake had left was the weight of his choices and the growing certainty that some mistakes echo forever. The final day arrived with the kind of crisp December morning that makes everything feel possible. Sunlight streaming through frost-etched windows to paint the hallways of Hillcrest Middle School in shades of gold and promise. But for Liam Matthews, this wasn't just another winter morning. It was the last time he would walk these corridors as a student, the end of a chapter that had nearly destroyed him and ultimately forged him into something unbreakable. 3 weeks had passed since the assembly that changed everything. 3 weeks of reporters camping outside the school, of college recruiters making unprecedented offers, of a viral fame that had transformed the quiet boy from the trailer park into the most talked-about teenager in America. The Westmont Institute had accelerated his admission process, and by January, Liam would be studying alongside PhD candidates and research fellows, working on projects that would have seemed like science fiction just months earlier. But fame, Liam had discovered, was a strange and complicated gift. The same students who'd ignored him for years now sought his attention with desperate enthusiasm. Teachers who'd looked through him now hung on his every word. Even the cafeteria staff smiled when he passed, as if proximity to greatness might somehow transform their own mundane existence. The only person who seemed unchanged by the seismic shift in Hillcrest's social geography was Liam himself. He moved through the hallways with the same quiet dignity he'd always possessed, answering questions with patient courtesy, helping struggling classmates with their homework, treating everyone, from the most popular students to the most forgotten, with identical respect and kindness. It was this consistency, this refusal to let success corrupt his character, that made what happened next so devastating for those who'd tried to break him. Jake Morrison had spent the past 3 weeks in a state of perpetual anxiety, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for some elaborate revenge scheme to unfold. He'd prepared apologies that went undelivered, planned explanations that no one seemed interested in hearing. The national media had indeed picked up the story of Liam's persecution, but they'd focused on the triumph rather than the tormentors, celebrating the victim's rise without dwelling on those who'd tried to prevent it, which somehow made everything worse. Jake found himself invisible in a way he'd never experienced, not ignored but irrelevant, existing on the periphery of a story where he'd once imagined himself the central character. Students whispered about him when they thought he wasn't listening, their voices carrying a mixture of disgust and pity that cut deeper than any direct confrontation could have. The end came not with drama or confrontation, but with a moment of such simple grace that it redefined everything Jake thought he understood about power and dignity. It happened in the hallway outside the main office, where Jake was retrieving a college application packet from his guidance counselor. As he turned to leave, he nearly collided with Liam, who was emerging from Principal Davidson's office with an armload of books and what appeared to be official transfer documents. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the narrow hallway. Predator and prey, tormentor and victim, the architect of cruelty and its target. Jake's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, years of practiced dominance evaporating in the face of quiet certainty that radiated from Liam like heat from a fire. "Jake," Liam said simply, his voice carrying neither anger nor triumph, just acknowledgement of their shared history. "Liam, Jake began, but the words that had seemed so important in his rehearsals now felt hollow and inadequate. What apology could possibly address months of systematic cruelty? What explanation could justify the deliberate attempt to destroy someone whose only crime had been existing in a space where Jake had decided he didn't belong? But Liam seemed to understand the impossibility of the moment. Instead of waiting for an apology that could never be sufficient, he did something that stopped Jake's heart. He extended his hand. "I wanted to thank you," Liam said, his words so unexpected that Jake wondered if he'd misheard. "Thank me?" Jake's voice cracked like a 12-year-old's, betraying the confusion and guilt that had been eating at him for weeks. "You and your friends taught me something important about systems," Liam explained, his grip firm and warm when Jake automatically took his hand, "about how they can be manipulated by people who understand the underlying structures. About how cruelty often masks fear, and how fear usually stems from not understanding something that seems different or threatening." Jake stared at him, unable to process the kindness in Liam's voice, the complete absence of hatred or desire for revenge. "I don't understand." "You were afraid of something you didn't recognize," Liam continued, "so you tried to destroy it instead of learning from it. That's a very human response, but it's also a very limiting one. The thing is, Jake, systems that rely on fear and exclusion are inherently unstable. They collapse as soon as someone refuses to participate in their logic." Around them, students were beginning to gather, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing something significant. But their attention felt different now. Not the bloodthirsty excitement that had accompanied Jake's previous performances of cruelty, but the hushed reverence usually reserved for moments of genuine importance. "I forgive you," Liam said quietly, the words carrying through the hallway with perfect clarity. "Not because what you did was acceptable, but because holding on to anger would poison the work I need to do. There are bigger problems to solve than the social dynamics of middle school. Bigger systems to repair than the one we've been trapped in here." The simplicity of it, the complete unconditional forgiveness, hit Jake harder than any revenge scheme could have. This wasn't mercy earned through apology or reformation. It was grace freely given, offered not because Jake deserved it, but because Liam had chosen to become someone who could give it. "I'm sorry," Jake finally managed, the words inadequate but genuine. "I'm so sorry for everything." Liam nodded, accepting the apology with the same calm dignity he'd shown throughout their entire interaction. "I know you are, and Jake, you're better than what you did to me. Don't let those months define who you become." Then he was walking away, his worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished linoleum, leaving Jake standing in a hallway that suddenly felt too small to contain the magnitude of what had just occurred. The gathered students dispersed slowly, their whispered conversations carrying notes of wonder and disbelief. Sarah Henderson, who'd been watching from near the trophy case, approached Jake with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Do you understand what just happened?" Jake shook his head, still processing the encounter. "He could have destroyed you," Sarah said quietly. "With his platform, his influence, his story, he could have made you the poster child for everything wrong with bullying culture. Instead, he chose to show you grace. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" As the day progressed, and news of Liam's final gesture spread through the school's gossip networks, Jake began to understand the true sophistication of what had occurred. This wasn't forgiveness as weakness. It was forgiveness as strength, mercy as mastery, grace as the ultimate expression of power held in check. By the time the final bell rang, signaling the end of Liam Matthews' career at Hillcrest Middle School, the transformation was complete. The quiet boy who'd entered these halls as a victim was leaving as something approaching legend, not for his technological brilliance alone, but for his refusal to let cruelty corrupt his character. Students lined the hallways as Liam made his way to the exit, their applause spontaneous and genuine. Teachers nodded respectfully as he passed. Even Principal Davidson emerged from his office to shake hands with the student who'd brought more positive attention to their school than any sports championship or academic achievement ever could. Harold Matthews waited in the parking lot beside their aging pickup truck, his weathered face bright with pride as he watched his grandson emerge from the building that had tried so hard to diminish him. The scholarship to Westmont was just the beginning. Already, there were whispers of fast-track degree programs, of research opportunities that could reshape entire fields of study. But as Liam climbed into the passenger seat and they drove away from Hillcrest for the last time, both grandfather and grandson understood that the real victory wasn't in the recognition or the opportunities ahead. It was in the choice to remain human in the face of inhuman treatment, to respond to darkness with light, to meet cruelty with an unshakable commitment to something better. Behind them, in the school they were leaving forever, Jake Morrison sat alone in his car, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror and trying to understand how someone he'd worked so hard to destroy had just shown him a path toward redemption he'd never imagined possible. The quiet boy from the trailer park was gone, transformed into something larger than the sum of his suffering. But the lessons he'd taught, about resilience, about grace, about the true nature of strength, would echo through the halls of Hillcrest Middle School long after his name was etched in the annals of technological history. Some stories end with revenge, others end with justice. But the best stories, the ones that change the people who witness them, end with grace freely given and wisdom born from pain, transformed into purpose. Liam Matthews had written that kind of story, and now, finally, he was free to begin the next chapter.